A Harvard professor called it impossible. Then a 9-year-old raised his hand. A child waits in a hallway. A chalkboard waits in silence. A moment that should have meant nothing rewrites everything. There were two reasons Olivier wasn't supposed to be there that day. First, the math building was under partial lockdown for exams. Unauthorized entry was strictly forbidden. Second, the class in room 14 didn't officially exist. And yet somehow the boy wandered into both. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. He was 10. His sneakers were patched with black tape, the heels peeled like tired paint. He didn't look lost, only quiet. He sat on the cold hallway floor outside the janitor's closet, a plastic bag of sliced apples in his lap, waiting for the sound of a mop bucket to stop sloshing. His father, Léon, was inside, cleaning up a spill someone had left after an exam. Olivier leaned back against the wall, chewing mechanically, eyes scanning the faded flyers on the bulletin board. One announced a symposium on abstract vector spaces. Another offered a reward for a missing USB drive. The third simply said, "Do not erase." It was scrawled in block letters over a photo of a whiteboard filled with symbols. Twisted, angular, almost alien. There were slashes through integrals, variables that floated beside symbols he'd never seen. And yet something about it made him stop chewing. He blinked, counted silently, closed his eyes. The apples in his mouth turned tasteless. That bored. He stood slowly. Across the hallway, the door to room 14 was propped open with a stack of old textbooks. Olivier stepped toward it, hesitating as his fingertips touched the frame. The room beyond was empty. Rows of desks sat like waiting chess pieces. At the front, a whiteboard stretched from wall to wall, filled with a single monstrous equation. He stepped inside. No voices, no sounds, just the smell of old markers and dry coffee. The symbols loomed larger up close, but not more threatening. To most, it might have looked like chaos. To him, it looked tired, like the equation had been trying to say something, but couldn't quite speak. He didn't solve it. Of course not. He didn't even try. But he reached for the red marker, just a line. There, between the fourth and fifth term, he boxed something, drew an arrow from one variable to another, then scratched a tiny symbol in the margin, a double bracket with a crossbar. He backed away, looked again. His breathing slowed. Behind him, a sound, the creak of a chair. A student, tall, older, slouched in the shadows of the back row, watched him silently, notebook half open on his lap. Olivier froze. The student said nothing for a long while, then stood and crossed the room. He looked at the board, looked at Olivier, then very quietly, "You just added a constraint to the boundary flow." Olivier didn't know what that meant. The student pulled out his phone and took a picture. Then he left without a word. 10 minutes later, Professor Nathan Everett stepped into the room, sleeves rolled up, carrying 2 coffees. One was meant for the graduate assistant who had just vanished. The other was for himself. He stopped cold when he saw the board. Then the boy. Then the red marks. "Who did this?" Olivier didn't answer. Everett stepped closer, frowning. "You added this?" Still nothing. The professor looked at him with clinical precision. "Do you know what this is?" Olivier shook his head, not in shame, but truthfully. Everett studied the mark again. It wasn't a solution, but it wasn't gibberish either. It was a shift in perspective, one that had taken his team of doctoral students 4 weeks to even consider. He sat down. "I want to talk to your father." Léon appeared shortly after, confused, tired, still smelling faintly of floor wax. Everett explained briefly that he believed Olivier had potential, something rare, something unteachable. He asked if they'd come to his office tomorrow morning. "I'd like to give him a chance," he said carefully. "To do what?" Léon asked. Everett sipped his coffee. "To prove that what happened here wasn't luck." Léon looked at his son. Olivier didn't speak, but he was still staring at the board, the way one might stare at the ocean after seeing a shadow move beneath it. That night, Olivier asked only one question as they walked home in silence. "Can I bring my own pencil?" The professor's office didn't look like it belonged to someone famous. There were stacks of journals balanced on heating vents. Chalk dust clung to the corners of the floor like spider webs. One shelf was crammed with empty coffee cups beside worn copies of logic theory textbooks. And behind the cluttered desk sat Professor Nathan Everett, the man who had once lectured at the European Institute of Pure Mathematics and walked out halfway through claiming they were solving the wrong problems. Now he studied Olivier across the desk as if he were another difficult equation. Léon sat beside his son, his cap still on, fidgeting with the bill. He didn't like being on university grounds unless a mop was involved. He also didn't like how the professor kept looking at Olivier as though he wasn't there to be spoken to, only tested. Finally, Everett leaned forward. "Olivier," he said, pronouncing it slowly, carefully, "I want to offer you something unusual." The boy sat still, pencil tucked behind his ear. "There's a private program run through this university," the professor continued. "It doesn't advertise. No applications, no flyers, just an entrance test. We don't care how old you are. We care whether you can think." He folded his hands. "I want you to take that test." Léon glanced sideways at his son. Olivier's hands were folded in his lap, but his fingers moved slightly, not nervously, but rhythmically. Counting something. Everett's voice grew more serious. "There's only one attempt. No retakes, no hints, no one-on-one tutoring beforehand. If you pass, you'll be the youngest person ever admitted. If you don't, the door closes." Léon cleared his throat. "What kind of test is this?" "A hard one," Everett replied without humor. 3 hours. Abstract logic, number theory, real analysis. Some problems even we don't know the answers to. He looked directly at Olivier. "I'm not interested in memorization. I want to see how your mind moves. I want to know if what you did yesterday was instinct or accident." The room was silent. Then Olivier asked his first question. "Can I solve it out of order?" Everett blinked. "Yes, of course." The boy nodded once. That was all. The test was scheduled 2 days later, in a room with no windows and one camera. It wasn't an ordinary classroom, but a glassed-in study space tucked into the archives wing of the mathematics library. No distractions, no clocks on the wall, just a stack of blank paper, 6 sharpened pencils, and a bottle of water. Everett stood outside the room watching through the security feed. He didn't expect a miracle. He expected the boy to struggle. That was the point, to see how he handled being overwhelmed. Olivier sat down without a word. He opened the test booklet, read the first page, then skipped to the last, and smiled. For the first hour, he didn't solve anything. He wrote definitions, drew diagrams, scribbled margins with loops and scratches. He circled instructions and underlined conditions, occasionally crossing something out completely and starting again. He flipped pages out of sequence. Page 7, then page 3, then page 9. At one point, he leaned back in the chair, eyes closed, mouth moving soundlessly. Then he bent forward again and filled 3 pages in near vertical handwriting, ignoring the lines on the page. Second hour, the pace changed. He began writing faster, more decisively. On the problem involving rotational symmetry of irrational tilings, a problem none of the graduate applicants had answered last year, he didn't solve it. Instead, he proposed 3 conditions under which it might be solvable, one of which no faculty member had ever considered. He titled the section, "Assumptions I Do Not Trust." The final page had only one prompt. What makes this problem important? It was about a recursive structure in time-based function collapse, the kind of thing even tenured professors avoided. Most answers submitted over the years mentioned its potential application in physics simulations or its theoretical implications. Olivier wrote 3 sentences. If a problem keeps repeating itself no matter how you approach it, it means we are misunderstanding something fundamental. Maybe not in math, maybe in time itself. Maybe we don't know what direction we're really facing. He put down the pencil, checked the paper, and sat quietly until the timer ended. Outside, Everett was silent. He hadn't expected answers, but he hadn't expected depth either. Léon met them at the entrance to the library. "Well?" he asked, eyes narrowing. Everett handed the test booklet to an assistant without looking. "He didn't finish all of it," the professor said. "But what he did finish?" He looked down at Olivier. "You weren't trying to win," he said quietly. "You were trying to see." The boy didn't respond. He was staring up at the dome of the library, watching the light reflect off the glass. "I'll be in touch," Everett added. "Soon." That night, Olivier said nothing during dinner. But before bed, he wrote something on the corner of a grocery receipt and gave it to his father. It said, "If I didn't pass, that's okay, but please don't say it was wasted." Leon kept that slip in his wallet for the rest of his life. The email came 3 days later. It wasn't long. No congratulatory language, no formalities, just a timestamp, a location, and one sentence. "Your son is invited to begin coursework on Monday." Leon read it twice before calling Olivier over. The boy scanned the screen, nodded once, and returned to sketching number spirals in the margin of the newspaper. There was no acceptance ceremony, no letter in gold trim, no handshake. But there was a silence in the house that evening. Not fear, not celebration, but something between the two. A kind of stillness that happens before a storm or a miracle. Olivier's first class was differential structures of French. He wore the same patched sneakers, the same overwashed gray sweater. He carried no backpack, just a pencil, a folded notebook, and a printout of the university map, marked with his father's handwriting, "Ask if you get lost." The lecture hall was a steep amphitheater, with 100 students already seated, most twice his height and 3 times his age. When he entered, no one noticed at first. Then the murmurs started. Someone whispered, "Who let in a kid?" Another snorted, "Child prodigy cosplay." A girl near the back asked softly, "Is this a prank?" Olivier took a seat in the third row. He didn't respond. He opened his notebook and began copying the chalkboard header, metric tensor and beyond. Professor Henri, a brisk man with no patience for ego or excuses, entered 5 minutes late and launched into the lecture without introductions. Olivier kept up without blinking. When asked to prove a preliminary lemma, no one raised a hand. Henri pointed randomly. "You," he said to Olivier. "Try." There was a beat of silence. The professor's tone hadn't been mocking, just curious. Olivier stood, walked to the board, took the chalk, and wrote not the answer, but a rewritten form of the problem, rotated, reframed. Then the proof followed, neat, spare, no decoration. He underlined the final line twice, then returned to his seat. Professor Henry paused, then said only, "That's correct." The next week the atmosphere changed, but not for the better. Whispers turned to cold shoulders. Some students rolled their eyes when Olivier entered the room. Others ignored him altogether. His presence was a challenge, not because he was rude or arrogant, but because he solved problems they couldn't, silently, with cheap shoes and secondhand clothes. One afternoon, he sat in the campus library working on a topology problem involving collapsing space curves. His paper was covered in notations, some of them his own invention. As he bent over the page, someone behind him muttered loud enough to hear, "Maybe he's just memorizing other people's work." Olivier looked up, but not at them. He looked at the page, at the way the loops refused to cancel neatly, at the way the curves seemed to fold inward instead of out. He wasn't even sure he was right, but he knew one thing. He hadn't copied anyone. 2 weeks later came the faculty challenge, Problem 19. It wasn't part of any syllabus. It had been pinned to the departmental bulletin board as a casual dare, a question about multi-dimensional series limits that had stumped 3 full professors and every graduate student who attempted it. The paper sat there for days. Olivier passed it on the third morning and paused. He read it once, then again. He didn't take it down. He went home that evening and spent 6 hours sketching. The answer came not in a flash, but in pieces. Shapes instead of formulas, relationships instead of sums. He didn't solve it completely, but he saw something no one else had, the hidden symmetry at the core, the illusion of divergence that wasn't divergence at all. He wrote his solution in pencil, folded it twice, and slid it into the faculty submissions box without signing his name. 2 days later, Professor Everett stood in the doorway of Olivier's lecture hall. He said nothing, just nodded to the boy. Olivier followed him outside. "Was that your handwriting on Problem 19? "Yes." Olivier said. It's not only correct, Everett said. It's elegant, but there's an issue. He pulled out a printed letter. This was submitted anonymously. The letter was typed. The accusation simple. That child could not have solved problem 19. He must have copied it. There was no signature, no proof, only suspicion. Olivier read the letter once, then walked to the nearest whiteboard, picked up a marker. He didn't defend the solution. He didn't argue logic. He simply wrote one sentence in block letters. I don't need you to believe in the answer. I need you to believe I walked the road. Professor Everett said nothing, but he didn't erase the board. 3 days later, the formal investigation concluded. The solution to problem 19 had been entirely original, cross-checked against every available source. Unique notation, unique method, and above all, an insight into asymmetry that no one else had ever suggested. The department dean made a rare public statement at the next faculty gathering. He made me believe, the dean said, not in the result, in the way he got there. Olivier's paper was published, without corrections. After that, something shifted. He was still mocked by a few, still ignored by many, but slowly, quietly, others began asking questions. How did you start this proof? What did you mean by that note in the margin? And one day a graduate student sat beside him in the cafeteria and said, Can you show me how you saw it? Olivier didn't smile. He just opened his notebook and began. The rust on the heater in Olivier's dorm room had peeled into the shape of a map. Fractured, nameless countries bleeding into each other. He stared at it each morning before class. He didn't decorate. He didn't bring posters, rugs, or a kettle. Just books, mostly borrowed, and a blanket from home that smelled faintly of soap and vinegar. The university had given him a cot too short for his legs, a desk with one broken drawer, and a small window that didn't close properly. Still, it was more than he'd ever had. But some things were harder than equations. No one called him by name. In the dining hall, he sat alone. He ate quietly, stacking his utensils with perfect symmetry when finished. Some students referred to him as the boy. Others whispered, Everett's pet. One evening, a tray slid off a nearby table and spilled hot soup across his shoes. No one apologized. He didn't complain. He simply removed his socks in the bathroom, rinsed them in the sink, and dried them with paper towels under the hand dryer. The next day, he returned to class. But knowledge does something, especially when it shows up every day, calmly, silently, without asking permission. By mid-semester, Olivier had earned the top score in 4 different courses. He had developed an alternative notation for conditional limit divergence that was now being informally used in the advanced seminars. And more quietly, he had begun tutoring. Not officially. He didn't set up posters or offer sessions, but people started finding him. It began with a girl from Linear Structures 2. She approached him outside the library. I failed the midterm, she said. I don't understand eigenvalues at all. Olivier paused, then asked a question she didn't expect. What do you think they're for? She blinked. What? What do you think they're trying to tell you? She opened her mouth, closed it again. I don't know. So he took out his notebook and drew 3 circles, then a square. Then he made the move. They're shadows, he said. But of what? That's what we're trying to answer. She didn't understand everything, but she listened, and she came back the next week. So did someone else, then 2 more. Olivier didn't say no, but he didn't advertise either. He simply started meeting with them. Always at night, always after hours, in empty classrooms or the quiet corners of the math building. They brought questions. He brought silence and pencils. They called it the night class. No one led it. No one marked attendance. But every Thursday at 2:14 in the morning, exactly, Olivier began. No lectures, no notes, just questions. What do you notice? What changes when you flip the problem? What if the mistake is in the question, not the answer? They weren't brilliant students. Some were failing. Some were too anxious to speak in class. But he treated every question as real. Every idea is worth pausing for. He never praised. He never laughed. But he listened. And slowly, those who had felt invisible began to see themselves differently. One night during the third month of these quiet gatherings, Professor Everett passed the darkened lecture hall on his way back from a conference call. The light was on. He paused, peeked through the glass. Olivier was standing at the board. He wasn't lecturing. He was watching another student solve a problem. Not correcting her, just waiting. She made an error. Realized it, backed up and fixed it without prompting. Everett didn't enter. But he smiled, a rare quiet expression that carried both pride and something else, respect. Still, not everyone approved. A few professors saw his midnight teaching as overstepping. One assistant lecturer called it unauthorized pedagogy. Another accused him of building a personality cult. But the students kept coming. Not for charisma, not for extra credit. They came because, with Olivier, failure didn't feel like shame. It felt like part of something real. One evening, a student named Ravi, older, soft-spoken, on the edge of academic probation, approached Olivier after a session. He held out a folded sheet of paper. "It's a graph," he said. "Temporal loops. I saw something weird in the recursion. I thought, maybe you'd know what to do with it." Olivier unfolded the paper, scanned it, said only, "This is interesting." He meant it. The next week, Ravi brought a second version, improved, tighter. By the end of the month, 3 students were helping refine it. Not as a class, as an idea. Professor Everett eventually heard about it. When he reviewed the draft, a recursive paradox in time-based graph structures, he read it 3 times in silence, then picked up the phone and made a call to the International Journal's review board. Not because it was finished, but because it asked the right question in the right way. It had started as a mistake. And it had become something worthy of the front page. One night, a student asked Olivier why he always started at 2:14. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Because that was when my father started cleaning the hallway every night." A pause. No one talked to him either. The walls hadn't disappeared. Some professors still doubted. Some students still whispered. But the windows were opening. And through them came people who thought they were too quiet to matter. Until someone, one boy with taped-up shoes and no titles, showed them they did. The morning the paper was published, Olivier didn't say a word. He read it once, folded it carefully, slid it under the mattress in his dorm, then went downstairs to breakfast like it was any other day. But it wasn't any other day. The paradox he'd resolved, the temporal graph collapse, had sat unsolved for over 30 years, passed around in whispers between conference halls and back pages of journals. Dozens had tried. Most had given up. And now the answer was in print, with his name. He didn't tell his father. He didn't post online. But within 24 hours, the faculty mailbox overflowed. Emails from Belgium, Japan, Argentina. One university wanted to offer him a teaching assistantship. Another, a full research grant. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it brought suspicion. 2 days after publication, an anonymous email was forwarded to the dean's office. It claimed the solution bore suspicious similarities to unpublished materials from a senior researcher at a conference 4 years earlier. No source, no specifics. But it was enough to trigger a formal inquiry. Olivier wasn't told at first. He found out when he arrived to teach his night class, and the building door had been locked early. He waited, then sat down on the concrete steps outside, notebook open on his knees. One by one, students arrived. They saw the locked doors, the empty windows. Then they saw him. They sat beside him. No complaints, just silence. They studied under the streetlight that night. The next morning, Everett called him into the office. "There's a review committee," he said, tone careful. "They'll want to ask questions, compare drafts, verify sources. It's standard procedure." Olivier listened. "Do you want a representative?" Everett asked. "Someone to speak on your behalf?" Olivier shook his head. "I'll speak," he said quietly, "but I won't argue." The hearing wasn't a courtroom, but it might as well have been. 3 faculty members, one outsider from the Ethics Review Board, a closed door, a stack of papers on the table. Olivier entered in silence. He wore a sweater 1 size too large and shoes still patched with black tape. The head of the panel gestured for him to sit. They asked their questions. Where had he first encountered the graph model? What made him pursue that line of reasoning? Why hadn't he cited similar work in adjacent fields? Olivier answered factually. He explained that he hadn't read the earlier work they mentioned, that he'd approached the problem from a different angle, starting not with equations but with rhythm, with the loop and the recursion, the moment where time seemed to turn inward. One professor asked, not unkindly, "And what made you trust that approach?" Olivier thought for a moment. Then he said, "Because it was the only part that didn't sound like someone else's voice." The room was quiet, no further questions. It took 4 days. On the 5th morning, Professor Everett found Olivier sitting on the back steps of the library, notebook in hand. He held out the letter. Olivier opened it. No violation found. Submission original. No further action. Beneath that, in a different ink, someone had written, "He made me believe." No name was signed, but the handwriting was the dean's. Olivier didn't smile, but he did exhale. That night, he returned to the night class. At 2:14 sharp, the door opened. More students than usual. Some new, some old. No announcement. No mention of the inquiry. He stood at the board, marker in hand. Wrote one line. "What's missing from the pattern?" And they began again. In the weeks that followed, something else began to shift. Other departments took notice. A visiting linguist asked if Olivier could help model recursive grammar loops. A physics professor sent a request for help visualizing time dilation in layered gravity wells. He didn't say yes to everything, but he started showing up, quietly, without fanfare. One afternoon, while walking to class, he passed a group of first-year students standing outside an office door, too nervous to knock. He paused, then walked back, opened the door for them, and nodded. That was all. Later that spring, a local TEDx organizer asked him to speak. He didn't want to. He hated stages. He hated lights. But Everett insisted it would matter. Not for the math, but for the others. "The quiet ones," he said. So Olivier agreed. He stepped onto the stage in a dark hoodie and worn jeans. No script, no podium, just a notebook in his hand. He began like this. "When I was 7, I drew a loop on a napkin. I didn't know it was math. I just knew it felt wrong. I wanted to fix it." The audience leaned in. He told them about the hallway, the board, the accusation, but mostly he talked about the Thursday nights and the hands that started to raise. He ended with this. "I don't want to teach the loudest person in the room. I want to teach the one who's too afraid to ask. Because I was him." A long silence followed, then applause. But he didn't wait for it. He walked off stage the way he'd entered, quietly. That summer, someone asked him if he felt like a genius now. He shook his head. "I don't feel small anymore," he said. "I feel real." And that was enough.